In the autumn of 1887, along the Missouri River bottomlands, while other women stuffed quilts with goose down and wool batting, Rebecca Thorne was doing something that made them whisper. She waded into frozen marshes, her hands raw, harvesting cattail heads swollen with silvery fluff. Neighbors called it swamp stuffing, a fool's gamble against a prairie winter. But Rebecca sewed every acre of that strange fiber into thick coats and quilts, stitching layer after layer as if her life depended on it. And when the mercury plunged to 38 degrees below zero, it would. Rebecca Thorne was no stranger to hardship. Her husband had died 2 winters earlier, leaving her alone with 3 children and a homestead on the unforgiving Dakota plains. Money was non-existent. Store-bought wool was a luxury she couldn't touch. But Rebecca had something no catalog could sell, miles of cattail marshes no one else valued. She'd spent summers watching the tall brown heads burst into clouds of fluff, wondering why such warmth was left to rot. That question hardened into obsession. By the first frost of 1887, she knew this winter would test more than her stitching. It would test whether nature already provided everything needed to survive. Rebecca's marsh was her storehouse. Every cattail head held thousands of tiny seeds wrapped in downy fibers so light they looked like smoke. To the neighbors, it was useless fuzz. To Rebecca, it was a gift left by a husband who could no longer provide. She gathered cattail heads by the sackful, wadding into the muck with her youngest strapped to her back. The stalks towered above her, some nearly 8 feet tall, their brown heads bursting at the slightest touch. She worked until her skirts froze stiff at the hem, filling every empty corner of the cabin with the strange silvery stuff. The children called it swamp silk. She called it survival. But survival had a smell damp, earthy, and unfamiliar. And the other women of the bottomlands, the ones who could afford wool batting and goose down, were not kind about it. The quilting circle at Martha Haskins' house was the heart of the settlement's social life, but Rebecca had stopped attending. One evening, her eldest daughter, Sarah, came home near tears after hearing the women laugh about their swamp witch. They said Rebecca was stuffing her quilts with ditch fluff, that her children would freeze the first hard night. Martha herself, a banker's wife who never missed a chance to remind others of her generosity, had held up a piece of cattail down between 2 fingers as if it were diseased. "This isn't warmth," she'd said. "This is what the wind leaves behind." The word spread like frost across glass. Soon, even the children at the schoolhouse whispered that the Thorne cabin would be an icebox before Christmas. But Rebecca had no choice, and that is a dangerous kind of clarity. Her husband, Nathan, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1885, leaving her with debts, a failing wheat claim, and 3 small mouths. The mercantile in town, run by a man named Silas Crane, had cut off her credit months earlier. She remembered the day she walked in, clutching a few old silver coins, hopping to buy wool batting. Silas had looked at her over his spectacles, then at the coins, and gently shook his head. "Mrs. Thorne, even if I gave you the wool, you'd owe me for the thread. Your husband's credit expired with him." He said it softly, almost kindly, but the message was absolute. She was on her own. That night, alone at the cabin, she looked at the cattail marshes stretching toward the Missouri like a forgotten kingdom. Every tall brown head was a promise her husband had never seen, and she decided she would trust the marsh over the mercantile. What followed was weeks of quiet, obsessive labor. Rebecca stripped the cattail heads, dried the fluff near the stove, and stitched it between layers of old flour sacks and worn muslin. Each stitch was an argument against the world's doubt. She discovered that the fibers, when packed densely, trapped air just like goose down. They resisted moisture, too. Wet cattail fluff still held warmth, a trick no wool could match. She made 3 thick coats for her children, each one quilted so tightly that a needle had to fight through the layers. She made a heavy blanket for their bed, and another for the baby's cradle. Then she made more. She didn't know why at first. Some instinct told her the cold coming would not limit itself to a single household. The children began to wear the coats outdoors. Benny, her 7-year-old, said the coat felt lighter than wool, like wearing a cloud. Sarah, older and more aware of the town's scorn, wore hers only when no one was looking, but she confessed one evening that her arms didn't ache from the cold the way they used to. Rebecca felt a fragile hope. Then October brought a warning. An old Métis trapper named Armand Lacroix passed through the bottomlands, checking his trap lines early. He noticed the cattail coats drying on the porch and knocked on Rebecca's door. He was old enough to remember when the Plains tribes used cattail down to line baby cradles and winter moccasins. He held one of her quilts in his calloused hands and nodded slowly. "The down is good," he said, "but the winter coming is not a normal winter. My bones tell me the air will bite deeper than a man's memory." He looked at her 3 children and then back at the quilt. "You have done the smart thing, but smart and enough are different things." He left before she could ask more. The first real test came in late November. A cold snap dropped the temperature to 20 below zero, hard and sudden. The wind screamed across the bottomlands, rattling windows across the settlement. Inside the thorn cabin, Rebecca sat awake all night, watching her children sleep beneath the cattail quilts. The stove burned low, fuel was scarce, but the children did not shiver. Benny kicked his blanket off in his sleep. Sarah slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The baby's cheeks stayed warm. By morning, Rebecca knew the fluff worked, but she also knew Armand's words echoed in the quiet. 20 below was not the worst. The worst was still coming, and the whole settlement would soon discover whether her swamp silk was genius or madness. In town, the whispers continued, but Rebecca no longer listened. She was too busy sewing. December arrived like a hammer wrapped in silk. The first week was bitter, the second was brutal, and by the middle of the month the Missouri River smoked like a kettle as warmer water surrendered to air that cut like glass. In town, men checked their snow fences and women inventoried their larders. No one worried about Rebecca Thorne anymore. They had forgotten her entirely, or so it seemed. She had become a cautionary tale told once and then dismissed, the swamp witch widow who would learn her lesson when the real cold came. But the real cold was already there, and inside the thorn cabin a strange truth was unfolding that no one outside could see. The children were not merely surviving. They were comfortable. This was not luck. Rebecca had not simply stuffed fluff into sacks and hoped for the best. She had studied the cattail the way a scholar studies a text, not from books, but from the marsh itself. She learned that a single cattail head contained over 200,000 seeds, each one attached to a wisp of down so fine it could float for miles. When packed together, those wisps created millions of tiny air pockets, the same principle behind goose down. But cattail had an advantage no farm goose could match. The fibers were naturally repellent to water. While wool collapsed when wet and bird down became a soggy, useless mass, cattail fluff kept its loft even when damp. In a prairie winter where snow might melt against a child's sleeve and freeze again, this difference meant survival. Rebecca learned this not from a text but from observation, watching marsh birds nest in the cattail heads during spring rains. The chicks stayed dry. She remembered that. She also learned something about cruelty. It lived not in the open but in small gestures. The Sunday before Christmas, Rebecca took the children to the settlement church for the first time in months. She dressed them in their cattail coats, hoping perhaps that the evidence would speak where she could not. The moment they walked through the doors, conversation hushed. Martha Haskins turned in her pew, her eyes moving slowly over the strange quilted garments as if inspecting filth. Her daughter leaned over and whispered loudly enough for half the congregation to hear. "Mother, they smell like a ditch." A ripple of stifled laughter followed. Rebecca's face burned, but she kept her eyes forward. Benny tugged at her sleeve, confused. Sarah stared at the floor with tears brimming. The service passed in a blur of humiliation. Afterward, on the frozen road home, Rebecca told them the same thing she told herself every night. Warmth isn't a smell, it's a heartbeat. But even as she said it, a colder thought settled beneath her ribs. If the worst came, no one in that church would knock on her door for help. Then the true winter arrived. On January 3rd, 1888, the wind shifted from the nor-northwest, carrying air that had started its journey over the ice sheets of the Canadian territories. The temperature dropped so fast that water thrown from a bucket froze before touching the ground, an old frontier legend that suddenly became visible truth. The old members of the settlement recognized the signs instantly. Horses grew skittish. Metal tools left outdoors would take skin from bare fingers. The snow no longer crunched underfoot, it screamed like crushed bone. This was not a cold snap. This was the beginning of an event that old-timers would call the Great Deep Freeze, and it would not end quickly. 3 days into the freeze, the first tragedy struck. The Haskins family, the wealthiest in the settlement, discovered that money could not buy immunity from physics. Their fine wool blankets, thick as fleece, lost their insulating power when the temperature dropped past 25 below. Wool fibers, Rebecca knew, trapped heat by crimping together, but in extreme cold, the moisture from human breath and body sweat condensed inside the fabric and froze. The Haskins house, for all its prosperity, became a tomb of cold. Their youngest son, a boy of 5 named Ellis, developed a rattling cough that deepened into something more dangerous. Martha Haskins, the woman who had laughed loudest in church, found herself in a nightmare no ridicule could solve. Word reached the Thorne cabin through Armand Lacroix, who passed by on his way to the trading post. He told Rebecca that Dr. Samuel Hart, the settlement physician, had done everything he could, but the boy's lungs were filling. The cold was killing him. "They've got wool and goose down," Armand said quietly, "but the cold doesn't care. The house won't hold heat." Rebecca listened without speaking. She thought of Martha's laughter. She thought of the smug faces in the church. And then she thought of a 5-year-old boy who had never mocked her, who was simply unable to stay warm. She looked at the extra quilts she had made, the ones she didn't quite have a reason for. There were 3 of them folded on a chair. She had not known why she made them. She knew now. But bringing those quilts would mean crossing almost 2 miles of open prairie in weather that froze horses in their traces. The wind chill was estimated at 60 below, enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. The children would need to stay alone, while she risked everything for a woman who had done nothing but torment her. Benny cried when she told them she was going. Sarah, older and harder, simply said, "They don't deserve it, Mama." Rebecca looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Nobody deserves to freeze," she said. Then she wrapped herself in her own cattail coat, pulled on 2 sets of mittens, and tied a scarf over every inch of exposed skin. She took the 3 extra quilts, wrapped them in oilcloth, and stepped into the screaming white void. What she found at the Haskins house would shatter every assumption the settlement held about her, and the temperature was still dropping. She had walked 2 miles through a storm that killed horses. The wind had sliced through every seam of her coat, freezing her eyelashes into brittle needles. But Rebecca Thorne did not stop. Inside the Haskins house, she found a scene that silenced her own heartbeat for a moment. The fine wool blankets Martha had boasted about lay crumpled in corners like discarded rags. The stove burned red-hot, yet the corners of the room were sheets of frost. And on a cot near the fire, 5-year-old Ellis Haskins lay struggling for air, his lips a pale lavender, his chest heaving with a rattle no mother should hear. Martha sat beside him, rocking, her face hollowed out by fear. She did not look up when Rebecca entered. Could not. The woman who had called her swamp witch now had nothing left but a dying son and the terror that the world was taking him. Rebecca did not hesitate. She stripped off her frozen mittens with her teeth, opened the oilcloth bundle, and pulled out the 3 extra quilts she had made for no reason she could name. She wrapped Ellis in the first, tucking it close around his shoulders, then the second and the third, until the boy was cocooned in cattail down. For a long minute, nothing changed. Charles Haskins stood frozen in the doorway, fists clenched, a man who had seen his wealth become useless. Then slowly the blue began to recede from the boy's lips. His breathing deepened. The terrible rattle softened. Martha let out a sound that was not quite a word, a thin whimper of disbelief. She reached out and touched the quilt, her fingers tracing the stitches she had once ridiculed. Outside, the temperature was still plummeting. It would eventually reach 38 degrees below zero, a cold so deep that the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales nearly kissed. At that extreme, ordinary wool lost its power, trapping moisture that froze inside the fibers. Goose down collapsed under the weight of frozen breath. Only the cattail fluff, with its water-repellent fibers and dense air pockets, continued to hold warmth. Rebecca knew this because she had seen it in the marsh birds, in the spring chicks that stayed dry while rain hammered the reeds. She had learned from the wild, and now that wild wisdom was keeping a child alive. But the night was not over. As Charles Haskins stumbled through a broken apology, Rebecca was already thinking of the Cooper farm to the east and the Larson cabin to the south. She had seen thin smoke from their chimneys earlier that week. Too thin. Charles, desperate to repay a debt he could not put into money, harnessed his draft horses to a freight sled, and they pushed into the white dark together, the banker and the swamp witch, a pairing no one would have believed. At the Cooper farm, they found the family burning chairs to stay warm, the woodpile buried under 10-foot drifts. The mother had given her coat to the youngest child and sat shivering in a thin shawl, her skin mottled with cold. Rebecca gave them 2 quilts. At the Larson cabin, the widow was nearly unconscious, her chimney choked with ice, the air inside thick with smoke. Rebecca dragged her out into the wind, wrapped her in cattail warmth, and held her until her eyes fluttered open. That night, Rebecca saved 4 families. Her own children, alone in the thorn cabin, waited wrapped in coats and blankets of the same strange material, safe in a warmth that cost nothing but a woman's isolation and grit. When the sun finally rose on the 4th day, the great freeze had killed dozens across the territory. Livestock stood frozen in fields. Some families were found in their beds, asphyxiated by their own sealed fires. But in the bottomlands along the Missouri, a miracle had quietly occurred. Every home where a cattail quilt had been placed was still standing, and everyone inside was still breathing. Word of this did not spread all at once. At first, it was only Martha Haskins, her pride shattered, who told the story. She told it in the mercantile, her voice shaking, while Silas Crane listened with his mouth slightly open. She told it at the church, where the same women who had laughed at the swamp witch now glanced at each other in shocked silence. Then the Coopers spoke. Then Mrs. Larson, who had been pulled from the edge of death, told anyone who would listen that the widow Thorne had walked through the blizzard to save her. The stories collided and multiplied. The settlement that had mocked Rebecca for months suddenly could not stop speaking her name. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one could have predicted. The Cattail Fluff, once derided as ditch stuffing, possessed a property that even Rebecca had not fully understood. It was not just warm. It was antimicrobial. The down contained natural compounds that resisted mold and bacteria, a trait the cattail used to protect its seeds in the wet marsh. In the aftermath of the freeze, as families in other settlements fell ill from the damp and the close quarters of recovery, the Thorne household and those she had aided remained strangely free of the pneumonia that swept through the region. Dr. Samuel Hart, who had treated Ellis Haskins, noticed the pattern and began quietly documenting it in his journals. He would later call it the cattail effect, though he never published his findings. He did not need to. The settlers who had survived were evidence enough. By March, when the thaw turned the trails to mud, Rebecca Thorne found herself at the center of something she had never sought, attention. And with attention came envy. Silas Crane, the mercantile owner who had cut off her credit, now saw a threat to his entire business. If women could gather warmth from the marsh for free, who would buy his wool batting? He began to whisper against her again, suggesting that the cattail quilts were a fluke, that the warm winter had helped more than the filling. But his words no longer carried weight, not when the bodies of those who had trusted wool lay in frozen ground, and the Thorns walked the streets in their strange light coats. Then the letters came. The story of the cattail quilts had traveled beyond the settlement, carried by trappers and freight drivers who passed through the bottomlands. Letters arrived from homesteads in 3 counties, women who had lost children to the cold, men who wanted to know how to prepare cattail down, families willing to pay for quilts made by the widow's own hands. One letter contained actual silver coins, a payment for a quilt the writer had only heard described. Another came from as far as Fort Randall, 150 miles away, asking for instructions. The swamp fluff had become a currency. Rebecca Thorne, illiterate until her husband taught her, now had to read letters from strangers who called her a savior. She did not know how to answer them. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the green shoots rise from the marsh, and realized that the winter had not just tested her. It had revealed a new life, one she had not chosen but could no longer refuse. The question that had started as survival, can I keep my children warm, had grown into something larger. Could she teach others to do the same? And if she did, what would happen to a world that had laughed at her first? The spring wind moved through the cattails, and for the first time in years, Rebecca was not just fighting to survive. She was being asked to lead. Rebecca answered the letters one by one, sitting at the same rough table where she had stitched her first quilt by lantern light. She had no education in business, no model for how a widow became a tradeswoman in a territory that barely recognized women as landowners. But she had something rarer than learning. She had proof. Every letter she wrote included a small square of cattail quilt, a sample that the recipient could hold and test. She described the gathering, the drying, the packing density required to trap air. She wrote in simple, precise language, exactly the way she worked. And she asked nothing up front. Try it, she wrote. If it keeps you warm, send what you think it's worth. That single decision to trust strangers as she had trusted the marsh would anchor her future. Spring deepened across the bottomlands. The cattail shoots pushed up through the mud, slender green spears that promised another harvest. Rebecca hired no help and sought no partner. She took her children into the marsh with her, just as she had the year before, but this time their hands were older and their eyes sharper. Benny learned to strip a cattail head in one motion without losing the fluff. Sarah became the record keeper, counting the sacks and marking the bundles with charcoal. The youngest, little Nathan, named for the father he never knew, toddled through the shallows with his arms full of brown heads. The work was ceaseless, but it was no longer desperate. It was a foundation. By June, the first orders arrived with money enclosed. Not promises, not barter, but actual coin. A farming family from Hanson County sent $2 for a full quilt. A widower near Fort Randall sent 75 cents for a child's coat. A schoolteacher in Yankton wrote that she had heard the story and wanted to pay for quilts to be given to families who could not afford them. The orders came from 3 counties, just as the spring letters had promised, and then from a fourth. Silas Crane, who had once cut off Rebecca's credit with polite finality, now watched wagons pass his mercantile carrying bundles of cattail fluff to the railway depot. He stood on his porch one afternoon as Rebecca walked by, a bundle of finished quilts over her shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them told the whole story. But the twist that no one expected came not from the orders or the money. It came from Dr. Samuel Hart, the settlement physician who had watched Ellis Haskins recover under a cattail quilt. He had been writing letters of his own to colleagues in St. Louis and Chicago, describing what he had witnessed during the Great Freeze. He had no laboratory, no formal training in botany, but his observations were meticulous. In late summer, a response arrived from the St. Louis Medical College. A professor of materia medica had read Hart's account with great interest and requested samples of the cattail down for analysis. The initial findings, he wrote, were extraordinary. The fibers contained naturally occurring compounds that inhibited bacterial growth, confirming what Hart had suspected. The cattail was not just warm, it was actively protective, and no one had ever documented this in the medical literature of the United States. When Dr. Hart brought the letter to Rebecca, she listened quietly, then asked a question he could not answer. "Will they make medicine from it?" He said he did not know. She nodded and returned to her stitching. The news did not change her daily work, but it changed how she was seen. The swamp witch had become a naturalist by accident, a scientist without a degree, and now the learned men in the East were taking notice. Martha Haskins, who had once held cattail fluff between 2 fingers like a disease, now commissioned a quilt for her sister in Ohio and insisted on paying double. Pride, Rebecca understood, could be as powerful an engine as shame. That autumn, a traveling journalist from the Omaha Bee, a man named Henry Driscoll, arrived by stagecoach. He had heard the story from a freight driver in Sioux City and tracked it to the bottomlands. He interviewed Rebecca on her porch while the children worked in the marsh beyond. He asked about the night of the Great Freeze, about the walk through the blizzard, about the sewing she still did every evening. He asked what she thought when she heard the temperature had fallen to 38 degrees below zero. She thought for a moment, then said, "I thought the marsh had not lied to me." Driscoll wrote it down and published it in the Bee on November 2, 1888. The headline read, "How a Dakota Widow Defeated the Arctic with a Swamp Plant." Within weeks, the story had been reprinted in newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco. Rebecca did not read the article. She was too busy. The publicity brought more orders than she could possibly fill alone. She began teaching other women in the settlement, the same women who had once laughed at her. She did not charge them for the knowledge. She simply showed them how to gather, how to dry, how to stitch. Martha Haskins learned beside Lydia Cooper. Old Mrs. Larson, who still owed her life to a cattail quilt, brought her granddaughter. A small industry grew along the Missouri bottomlands, built from a plant that had been dismissed as ditch waste for a century. By the following winter, cattail quilts were being shipped as far as Minnesota and Iowa, and the bottomland settlement had become known, quietly, as the warmest pocket of the Dakota Territory. But the final surprise came years later, long after the Great Freeze had passed into memory. In 1893, a public health report on infant mortality in cold climates cited the antimicrobial properties of cattail down as a factor in reducing pneumonia among frontier children. The report did not mention Rebecca by name. It didn't need to. The knowledge she had extracted from the marsh had entered the world, and once knowledge enters the world, it belongs to everyone. Benny Thorne, grown into a man, read the report aloud to his mother one evening. She listened, her hand still now, the sewing laid aside. Then she said, "The marsh knew all along." And that was the thing about Rebecca Thorne. She never took credit the way others needed it. She simply remembered where the wisdom came from. The question now was whether the world she had changed would remember her at all, or whether the cattail itself would remain the only witness to what a woman with nothing had built from fluff and faith. The world did not build statues to Rebecca Thorne. No town renamed itself after her. No school taught her name alongside the inventors and industrialists who filled the newspapers of her age. But in the bottomlands along the Missouri, her legacy did not need stone. It grew from the mud every spring. Women who had once never entered the marsh now walked its edges with their daughters, gathering the tall brown heads that had once been considered waste. They stitched cattail quilts for their own children, taught the skill to their neighbors, passed it forward without patent or payment. The knowledge Rebecca had extracted from cold and desperation became a quiet inheritance that outlasted the Great Freeze, outlasted the memory of those who had mocked her, outlasted even the mercantile that had cut her credit. Sela's crane store is gone, the Haskins' fortune scattered, but the cattail still grows, and that is the part of the story that history tends to miss. We remember the generals and the railway barons, the men who bent the frontier to their will. But the frontier was also bent by women like Rebecca Thorne, who did not conquer nature but listened to it. She was not trying to be remarkable. She was trying to keep her children from freezing. In doing so, she uncovered a truth that had been waiting in the marsh for 10,000 years, known to the tribes who had long used the plant, ignored by the settlers who dismissed it as swamp fuzz. She did not invent anything. She simply paid attention to what was already there and had the courage to trust it when everyone around her called her a fool. What wisdom are we walking past right now? What resource, what plant, what simple truth is waiting in the margins of our own lives, dismissed because it does not come with a price tag or a patent? Rebecca's story asks that question not through argument but through action. She did not argue with the mercantile. She waded into the marsh. She did not try to convince the church ladies. She wrapped a dying boy in a quilt and let the warmth speak. The cattail became her testimony. And in the end, the same neighbors who had laughed at her came to her door not with apologies but with need, and she answered. The frontier required many things of those who crossed it. Strength, certainly. Endurance, always. But Rebecca Thorne proved that the most indispensable frontier skill was not the ability to fight the world but the humility to learn from it. The cattail did not look like a savior. It looked like a weed. That might be the whole point. If these stories matter to you, if you believe that forgotten women and overlooked ideas deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel. We are uncovering the hidden history of the ordinary people who did extraordinary things, not with armies or fortunes, but with attention and grit. Hit subscribe and the bell, and we will see you in the next one. Because there are more stories like Rebecca's waiting to be told, and the marsh is full of voices we haven't heard yet.